We arrived at the campsite just as the sun was setting, the sky turning a deep orange behind the thick line of trees. The air was cool, with a dense fog creeping in from the nearby lake, giving the woods an eerie, unsettling atmosphere. My friends were excited, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As we set up our tents near the edge of the lake, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, convinced I saw movement between the trees. That first night, everything seemed calm at first. We sat around the fire, laughing and telling stories, but there was an odd tension hanging in the air. The fire crackled loudly, but beyond that, the forest was strangely quiet. No sounds of animals or rustling leaves, just silence. The stillness only made the night feel more oppressive, like the woods themselves were watching us. Around midnight, I decided to head to my tent. The fire was dying down, and the others were slowly drifting off to sleep. As I lay there in my sleeping bag, I began to hear soft footsteps outside the tent. My heart started to race. They were slow, deliberate, circling the camp. I held my breath, too scared to move. I strained my ears, trying to convince myself it was just one of my friends, but the sound was too light, too cautious. The footsteps eventually faded away, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I stayed awake for hours, listening to every little noise outside. When I finally fell asleep, it was with the uneasy thought that we weren't alone in those woods. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy, the events of the previous night still fresh in my mind. My friends were already up, laughing and making breakfast, as if nothing strange had happened. I debated whether to mention the footsteps, but decided against it. Maybe I had just imagined it. Still, the memory clung to me like the mist that hadn't quite lifted from the lake. We spent the day hiking along a nearby trail. The trees towered over us, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. Despite the beauty of the woods, I couldn't shake the growing unease. Every crack of a twig or rustle in the underbrush sent my heart racing. My friends, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to the atmosphere, chatting excitedly about the next spot we would explore. As we walked deeper into the forest, I began to feel that same presence from the night before, something just beyond the edge of my vision, watching us. I stopped, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just trees, stretching endlessly into the distance. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at my mind. I tried to push it aside and focus on the hike, but it was like a shadow following me. That night, as we gathered around the fire again, I noticed the woods were even quieter than before. The usual sounds of nature seemed absent, replaced by an unsettling silence. The firelight flickered across the faces of my friends, casting long shadows that danced around the campsite. I couldn't help but feel like something was lurking just beyond the light, waiting. When I finally retreated to my tent, the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer, circling my tent slowly. I lay perfectly still, every muscle tense, listening to the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would stop. But the footsteps didn't fade this time. They paused, just outside the tent, as if whatever it was had finally decided to make its presence known. The next morning, I woke up drenched in sweat, even though the air was cool. My friends seemed oblivious to the strange happenings around us, their cheerful voices cutting through the thick tension I felt. I couldn't let it go. I decided to venture off on my own, hoping to clear my mind and maybe find some answers. I told my friends I was going to check out a nearby trail, But in reality, I wanted to explore the woods on my own terms. I wandered deeper into the forest, the sounds of the campsite growing fainter with every step. The trees closed in around me, and soon I was completely alone. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, more suffocating. My eyes scanned the dense foliage for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the eerie silence that had been haunting me since our arrival. That's when I saw it. A small, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. The cabin looked ancient, its wooden planks rotting and covered in moss. I hesitated at the door, feeling a strange pull to go inside. Pushing it open, I was hit with a wave of damp, musty air. The interior was dark, with only a few thin beams of light slipping through the cracks in the walls. Carvings covered every surface, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep into the wood. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into something far older and darker than I had anticipated. I moved further inside, trying to make sense of the strange symbols. That's when I heard it. Soft footsteps, the same ones from the night before. But this time, they were inside the cabin with me. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned around, expecting to see something horrifying. But there was nothing. Just the empty, decaying cabin and the oppressive silence. The footsteps stopped, but the sense of being watched remained, stronger than ever. I bolted out of the cabin, my pulse racing, and sprinted back toward camp. The woods seemed darker now, and the once familiar trail felt like a labyrinth designed to trap me. Branches clawed at my clothes as I rushed past, stumbling over roots hidden beneath the dense undergrowth. The eerie silence that had haunted me was gone, replaced by the howling wind and the distant rumble of thunder. It felt as though the entire forest was alive, watching, waiting for me to fall. Just as the first drops of rain began to fall, I caught sight of the campsite. Relief flooded over me, but it was short-lived. Standing at the edge of the camp was an old man, his clothes tattered and dirty, his eyes hollow, but somehow gentle. He raised a hand in a silent greeting, and despite the terror that had consumed me, I felt strangely calm in his presence. He motioned for me to follow him, and without thinking, I did. The old man led me through a narrow path I hadn't noticed before, winding through the trees. I felt an inexplicable trust in him, even as the storm picked up, thunder cracking overhead. Finally, we emerged at the edge of the lake, the campsite now far behind us. He pointed across the water, and as I followed his gaze, I saw the outline of my friends on the other side, huddled under a small shelter they had erected. Somehow, they had made it to safety before the storm hit. I turned to thank the old man, but he was gone. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around frantically, but there was no trace of him anywhere. Bewildered, I made my way around the lake and joined my friends. When I told them what had happened, they looked at me strangely. There hadn't been any rangers in this area for years, they said. I tried to make sense of it, but deep down, I knew I had been helped by something beyond explanation. That night, as the storm raged on, I felt a sense of peace. Whatever presence had been watching us seemed to have lifted, leaving behind only the quiet of the woods. I never saw the old man again, but I knew that somehow we had been protected. We set up camp on a crisp, clear evening in late September. The air was cool, the sky painted in shades of purple and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. The campsite was perfect. nestled deep within a dense forest, with a small clearing that allowed just enough space for our tents and a fire pit. As we pitched our tents, everything felt calm, the kind of peace you only get far away from civilization. Night fell quickly, and soon the only light came from the flickering flames of our campfire. We huddled around it, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories that seemed harmless in the warmth of the firelight. The forest surrounding us was dark and quiet, only the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the stillness. It was the kind of quiet that felt unnaturally heavy, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Around midnight, one of our friends, Steve, got up to check on his tent. He had set it up a little further from the group, wanting a bit of privacy. But when he reached the spot, his tent was gone. Not collapsed or moved, just gone, as if it had never been there. We all laughed at first, assuming he had forgotten where he pitched it, or that someone was playing a prank. But after a thorough search of the area, it became clear that the tent had simply vanished without a trace. The mood shifted instantly. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe Steve had set up somewhere else. Maybe we were just tired. But no matter how much we tried to explain it away, there was no denying that something strange had happened. The feeling of unease grew as we returned to the fire, our laughter replaced by nervous glances into the dark woods. The shadows seemed deeper now, and every small noise felt like a threat. The forest was no longer just a backdrop to our fun. It had become something ominous, something that was watching us. The unease lingered the next morning as we tried to laugh off the weirdness from the night before. Steve was still in disbelief, swearing up and down that he had set his tent up exactly where he thought. We all helped him search again, this time in daylight, combing through the surrounding woods. But there was no sign of his tent. No tracks, no remnants, nothing. It was as if it had simply evaporated into the misty air of the forest. Later that afternoon, while some of us gathered firewood and others tried to explore the area, strange things started happening. Small items began to disappear. First, Steve's sleeping bag, then my flashlight. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, maybe someone moving things around without thinking. But as the list of missing items grew, so did our anxiety. The unsettling feeling from the night before returned, creeping back into our thoughts. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful at first, now felt like a living thing, swallowing up pieces of our camp. That evening, as the sun dipped low again, we noticed something even stranger. A series of lights appeared above the trees, soft at first, like faint orbs floating just out of reach. At first, we thought it was some kind of natural phenomenon, fireflies maybe, or a trick of the light. But as we watched, the lights began to move, circling the perimeter of our camp, growing brighter and more intense. They seemed to pulse, lighting up the edges of the clearing in brief, eerie bursts. No one said anything for a long time. We just stood there, watching the lights flicker and move like some sort of ethereal dance. The silence in the group was thick with fear, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. We all felt it. The forest was changing, and we were right in the middle of something we didn't understand. I could feel my pulse quicken as the lights hovered just beyond the reach of the firelight, and a cold dread began to settle deep in my chest. The next morning, we made a decision. We needed answers. After a tense breakfast, we agreed to venture deeper into the woods and look for any clues about what was happening. We broke into pairs and headed in different directions, armed with what little courage we could muster. I partnered with Steve, and we took the trail leading further into the heart of the forest, hoping to find some logical explanation for the strange lights and missing items. As we walked, the trees seemed to grow denser, their branches twisting overhead to form a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. Even the occasional bird call or rustling leaves were absent, replaced by a silence that felt oppressive, almost unnatural. My senses were on high alert, every crack of a twig beneath my feet sending a jolt of adrenaline through my body. After nearly an hour of hiking, we stumbled upon something odd. A clearing surrounded by trees, each one marked with strange carvings. The symbols were similar to the ones we had seen the night before in the lights, though less clear. They looked ancient, etched deep into the bark as if they had been there for centuries. Steve and I exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what we had found. As we stood there, a soft whispering sound filled the air. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but it grew louder with each passing second. The whispers seemed to be coming from all around us, though no one else was there. We turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, but it was impossible. The forest itself seemed to be speaking, its voice low and urgent, filling my head with dread. Suddenly, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement in the trees. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the dense forest and the heavy silence that had fallen once again. Steve was pale, his face tense with fear. "Let's get out of here," he whispered, and I nodded in agreement. We hurried back toward camp, the feeling of being watched following us every step of the way. When we finally returned to camp, the others were already packing up, their faces drawn with the same fear we had felt in the clearing. No one spoke much, but it was clear we all had experienced something we couldn't explain. Steve and I briefly mentioned the carvings and the whispers, but it seemed pointless. We all knew, deep down, that whatever was happening in these woods went far beyond anything we could comprehend. As we loaded up the last of our gear, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. One of the tents had reappeared. It was Steve's tent, the one that had vanished on the first night, sitting exactly where he had set it up. The fabric looked untouched, as though it had never been gone in the first place. I stared at it for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I called out to Steve, but when he turned to look, the tent was gone again, as if it had never been there. Panic set in. We rushed to get into the car, our nerves frayed and our minds racing. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. The trees closed in around the road, and for a moment, I thought I saw those same strange lights flickering deep in the forest. But when I blinked, they were gone. As we left the campsite behind, a heavy silence filled the car. No one spoke about the missing tent, the lights, or the whispers. We just drove, putting as much distance between us and the woods as possible. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that we left something behind. Or maybe, just maybe, we brought something back with us. It had been weeks since the breakup, and I couldn't stand being surrounded by people any longer. So, I packed up my gear and headed to a remote campsite deep in the woods. I needed the quiet, needed to be alone with my thoughts, even if they tormented me. The air was crisp, the leaves beginning to turn gold and orange as the early days of October rolled in. The campsite was isolated, just as I wanted it. No one around for miles, only the towering trees and the endless sky. As night fell, I built a small fire. The warmth from the flames did little to chase away the cold that had settled in my chest, but I focused on the crackling sound, trying to find some comfort in it. The stars above were brilliant, shining through the gaps in the canopy like tiny beacons of hope, but they felt distant, unreachable. The isolation was what I had wanted, but now that I was here, it felt heavier than I'd imagined. The loneliness crept in, filling every silent space between the flickers of the fire. Then, I started hearing it. Faint laughter, carried on the wind. At first, I thought I was imagining it, my mind playing tricks on me. But the laughter persisted, growing louder and more distinct. It wasn't joyous, though. There was something off about it, something hollow. I stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the glow of my fire. I couldn't see anything, just the dark, looming trees. My pulse quickened as I strained to listen, trying to make sense of the strange sounds. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but no one responded. The laughter faded into the rustling of the leaves, and I was left standing there, feeling more alone than ever. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the wind, maybe someone camping far off that I couldn't see. But deep down, I knew. The laughter wasn't coming from another campsite. It was something else entirely, something the darkness was hiding. The next day, I tried to shake off the strange feeling from the night before. I spent the morning hiking, hoping the fresh air and the beauty of the woods would clear my head. The trails were peaceful, the sound of my boots crunching on the fallen leaves, the only noise that accompanied me. But no matter how far I walked or how many sights I took in, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. As the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky, I returned to camp, exhausted, but no more at ease than when I'd left. The wind had picked up, sending leaves swirling through the air in sudden gusts. I gathered some firewood and tried to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept drifting back to the laughter. Was it just my imagination? Had I let my own isolation get to me? I wasn't sure anymore, but I knew that I didn't feel as alone as I should. That evening, as the fire crackled and the sky grew darker, the sounds returned. This time, it wasn't just laughter. There was music too, faint and haunting, drifting through the trees like an echo from another time. I stood up, peering into the shadows, but again, there was nothing. No other campers, no lights, no sign of life at all. Just the same endless stretch of dark woods surrounding me. I called out again, more desperate this time, but there was no response. The music grew louder, filling the clearing, and with it came the laughter, now distorted, twisted into something almost cruel. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped away from the fire, instinctively backing toward my tent. The wind howled through the trees, and for a moment, I swore I saw figures moving in the darkness, shadowy shapes flitting between the trees, just beyond the edge of the firelight. I blinked, and they were gone. But the music and laughter remained, echoing in my ears long after the wind had died down. I spent the next day in a daze, my mind trapped between disbelief and fear. What had started as a peaceful escape had quickly turned into a nightmare, though I couldn't put a name to what was happening. The isolation that I had once craved now felt suffocating. The forest, with all its beauty and serenity, had become a prison, each tree a silent witness to the strange events unfolding around me. Determined to regain some control over my situation, I decided to explore the surrounding area again. This time, I wasn't just walking aimlessly. I was searching, looking for anything that could explain the music, the laughter, or the figures I thought I had seen. The forest stretched on endlessly, the trail winding through dense thickets and up steep inclines. But as I pushed deeper into the woods, I began to notice signs that something else had been here before me. There were footprints, faint and barely visible, pressed into the soft earth near a clearing. They were not mine, too large, too deep. I followed them for a while, curiosity mingling with dread, my heart pounding in my chest. The footprints led me to an area where the trees seemed different. They were older, their bark twisted and gnarled, as if they had been shaped by some unseen force. The air was heavier here, colder. The wind that had been a constant companion on my hike had died down, leaving only an eerie stillness. At the center of the clearing stood a large stone, weathered and covered in moss. There were carvings on it, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep into the surface. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached, the strange markings drawing me in despite my fear. I ran my fingers over the stone, feeling the rough texture beneath my skin. The carvings were old, ancient even, and they pulsed with a strange energy that seemed to hum in the air around me. Then, without warning, the laughter returned. It was louder now, more real, as if it were coming from right behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and dance, but I couldn't see anything solid, anything real. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps as I backed away from the stone, the laughter growing louder and more distorted with every step. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me back through the woods at a pace that felt frantic, desperate. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees bending and twisting in my peripheral vision. The laughter followed me, echoing in my ears, driving me forward even though I didn't know where I was running to. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself was trying to hold me back, to keep me within its grasp. When I finally burst out of the dense trees and into the clearing where my campsite stood, the laughter stopped abruptly. The silence was so sudden, it felt like a physical weight had been lifted off me. I stumbled to the fire pit, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I collapsed onto the ground, my eyes wide as I stared into the dying embers of the fire, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The music and the laughter might have stopped, but the feeling of being watched had not. I could feel it. Something was still out there, hidden among the trees, waiting. My mind raced, trying to piece together what it all meant, but there were no answers. Just more questions, more confusion. And the one thought that kept running through my mind, over and over, was that I wasn't going to make it through another night alone. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint whispers, the echo of the eerie laughter from the woods. The fire had died out completely, leaving me wrapped in darkness. Only my flashlight providing a small circle of comfort. But it was a fragile comfort. The feeling of being watched never left me. Every gust of wind against my tent sounded like footsteps, every crack of a branch like something creeping closer. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I awoke to the sound of music, soft, haunting notes drifting through the still night air. I froze, my heart racing. The music was coming from just beyond the clearing, as if someone or something was trying to lure me back into the forest. I knew I should ignore it, stay in my tent until morning, but the pull was too strong. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night. The campsite was eerily quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the music playing softly from the darkness. I followed the sound, my steps tentative as I moved toward the edge of the clearing. The flashlight beam cut through the shadows, but it didn't reach far. The trees loomed tall and silent, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. My breath came in shallow gasps as I approached the spot where I had seen the figures before. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the music stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, frozen in place, straining to hear something, anything, but there was nothing, just the heavy, oppressive stillness of the night. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to run to the safety of my tent, but my body refused to move. It was as if the forest itself was holding me there, trapped in that moment of dread. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the faint moonlight. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned the flashlight toward it. The beam flickered, then died. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the light, but it refused to come back on. I was plunged into darkness, the figure now hidden in the shadows once more. My hands shook as I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the clearing. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I stumbled back toward my tent, desperate to get inside and away from whatever was lurking in the trees. But as I reached the tent, I froze. The music had started again, louder this time, more insistent. I turned, and there it was, the figure, standing right at the edge of the clearing, closer now. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, paralyzed by fear. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. The music played on, filling the air with its haunting melody. My mind raced, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The isolation I had once sought now felt like a death sentence. Then just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure faded back into the darkness, the music growing fainter with it. The feeling of dread slowly lifted, leaving me standing there, alone in the silence once more. But something had changed. I no longer felt alone in the forest. Not truly. Whatever had been watching me was still there, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to return. I packed up and left at first light, never looking back. But even now, weeks later, I can still hear the music sometimes. Soft, faint, like an echo of that night. And I know, deep down, that the forest never really let me go.